Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Jesco again from AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. And I'm back with Graham from Music City Acoustics. Hey, Graham, how's it going?
Hey, great. How are you doing?
I'm great. We're about to dive into the fourth video in our series of treating the demo room that you just built out. So for everybody watching, there's parts 1, 2, and 3 where we dove into, first of all, figuring out the positioning of the mixing setup, the listening position, and the speakers in video 1. Then we looked at actually designing and installing all the treatment for this room in video 2. Then obviously we did a in-depth comparison of before and after measurements in video 3. All of those are linked in the description. And in this video, we're going to look at resonance traps, membrane traps. Before we do that, Graham, you've prepared a download for people watching. Basically, you want to make all the measurements available that we collected throughout the series.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of all of the REW measurements that we've taken. So, the empty room, different listening positions, all the way up to putting in treatments, individual places. We'll put all that into one REW MDAT file so that people can take that, analyze the changes, kind of see what's going on, and give them a really good reference point if they don't have, the ability to treat their room in 100 different ways or anything like that. But that way they can get really hands-on with the measurements and dive into what's going and start analyzing those and getting more familiar with the software so they can utilize it in their space.
Sweet. I think that's going to be great. Yeah. So for everybody watching, if you want to download that, that's going to be at the link in the description as well. And with that, shall we have a look at what effect we got from your resonance traps?
Let's do it.
Yeah. Sweet. And maybe we can just start by, can you explain to us, first of all, what are resonance traps in the first place? What are the particular resonance traps that you built and actually put in the room now?
Yeah. So resonance trap or membrane trap is something that we typically have the ability to tune to specific frequencies. So unlike the porous absorbers that we put in here that are going to work on more broadband or more broadly across the frequency spectrum, the tuned membrane traps or resonance absorbers are going to target specific low frequency problem areas typically. We can tune them based off of the depth of the actual box and the density of the membrane that's used. In this case, we have 2 foot by 2 foot boxes. Mm-hmm. And then depending on the frequency that we're targeting, the depth of that box and the density of the membrane that we use is going to change. We were targeting 32 hertz and 64 hertz in this room. So basically the two lowest axial modes front to back. And so the 32 hertz box that we have is pretty beefy. It's, I think, 12 inches deep or so and has a 2-pound mass loaded vinyl membrane on it. And then the 64 hertz boxes are about 7 inches deep, and they have a 1-pound mass loaded vinyl on it. So a little bit lighter, but they're both, just tuned to target those specific problems, kind of the lowest octave band area that we have, that 32 hertz range, as low as you can get in this room, and that these speakers can push, really trying to control that as much as possible. And then just the octave above that, really trying to further control that front to back axial mode where we have a lot of energy. And they did some cool things.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing that. How do they actually work, these membrane traps? I know there are different types of resonance traps, like there are Helmholtz resonators, for example. How do these membrane traps work in comparison?
Yeah, so membrane traps are like an airtight sealed box typically, and then that membrane is across the front of the box. And so the way they work kind of like a drum, but in reverse. So basically the sound waves as they're traveling across the room hit the membrane. And at the tuning, depending on what the tuning of that box is, that membrane will start to resonate at certain frequencies or at the center frequency that it's tuned to. So you want that membrane to start resonating at whatever frequency you're trying to reduce the energy of in the room. And so in our case, if we tune that to 32 hertz, when that energy hits that membrane, it's going to start moving. And as it's moving, it's reducing the energy that can then be reflected back into the room, how long it can actually decay in the room and shorten that up. So it's basically just turning that acoustic energy into heat as it's moving. It does that through basically kind of an impedance change within the box itself and the tuning of that membrane. So the rigidity of the box, the way that it's constructed, making it airtight, all of that kind of contributes to how effective they're going to be.
Right. Okay. And I mean, that also changes kind of the effect on the actual kind of acoustics, right? This isn't a broadband absorber. This is a very narrow band absorber, right? So can you just kind of outline in terms of the effects on the time response and the frequency response? How does that show up?
Totally. So typically with the membrane traps, we're really targeting the time response. You will, depending on like the stage that the room is treated, see an improvement typically in the frequency response to some degree, but much less so than you'll see on the time domain, where you can really start to control things. And that's where I would say they're the most powerful, and where I would recommend implementing them the most is when you really want to tighten up the decay time of your low end, improve things on that end so that you get more punch, clarity, and focus in the lowest octaves in your room. So the membrane traps that we make, 2 by 2 foot box isn't massive in size. And because of that, the Q, or how broad of an area that they'll actually absorb, is pretty narrow.
Right.
And so they're really ideal when you're trying to target like specific room mode problems that are still occurring in your room after it's been fully treated, or areas just that that are going to be really problematic from the get-go because there's so much energy and power within those room modes if they're overlapping and that kind of thing.
Right. And I mean, that's a great segue to my next question which is why only do this now at the very end? Like, all this that you just said kind of sounds awesome and is typically the problem we're facing right from the start in most rooms. Why don't we start with that? Why do it only now at the very end instead?
Yeah. So we start with the end typically because I know both you and I generally working on like home studios, spaces that aren't built from the ground up or don't necessarily have huge budgets. And so going back to what we talked about in video 2 with like our design approach and philosophy, one of the main factors in what we can typically do is budget and space. And membrane traps, despite being pretty small in their footprint, particularly when you're talking about dealing with like 32 hertz, something that's incredibly challenging to do with a porous absorber, they don't have a huge footprint. They still take up a good bit of space. And in a small room and in a room that doesn't necessarily have a huge budget, it's a very ineffective approach to treating the whole frequency spectrum.
Yeah.
So it's typically something that we would do at the end of kind of building out a room or designing the treatment, if there's still room for it, if there's still budget for it, because while it makes a huge difference, it does so in a very small area. So if you're, professional mixing engineer or mastering engineer, and you're spending day in and day out, these are the things that are going to be really helpful for you. But if you're doing it part-time or are working on it and trying to make that your job, or just having fun and practicing and mixing your band's records, it's not something that's going to by any means give you the most bang for your buck. It is a very targeted approach to treating a room, and it's not an area that I would ever really start with unless we know we're doing a full-on build out. Yeah.
And I mean, and this is despite the fact that if you were to put them in an untreated room or in a very kind of partially treated room, the effect would probably be stronger just because there is still more energy in those lowest frequencies left over, right? But even though that is typically the case, we would still recommend to do this at the very end, right? Because of what you just said.
Yeah, because the effect would be stronger and they'd perform better, but they'd only perform better at 3-4 frequencies, depending on how many tunings you had in your room. So do you get more out of them? Yes. But do you get a better, more balanced frequency response across the entire frequency spectrum? Probably not.
Yeah. And this comes back to the whole thing, this whole aspect of that you want to see the entire room as a system, as a whole, right? And sure, when you get into treating individual aspects, you can target individual aspects, but from a planning perspective, you want to see the room as an entire system where a lot of the effects also happen higher up, and you need to treat those as well. We're talking obviously reflections. We're just talking a general reduction in reverb time in the mids and highs as well, right? And if you use up all that space with a bunch of boxes that hit 32 hertz, it's going to be tricky to do that.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of people don't have speakers that go down to 32 hertz.
Yeah, that also.
So it just kind of depends on the room and the setup.
Yeah. So maybe getting a bit more practical, how many did you put in the room and why?
Yeah, so we've got 4 tuned to 32 hertz and 4 tuned to 64 hertz, and they are all on the back wall. And going into this project and the design, we kind of knew that would probably end up happening. So the why is more so just kind of in terms of how they work. Typically, if you just put one of those boxes in here, it will make an improvement, but not a huge improvement. Not enough to really see a big change on the frequency response or the time domain. So it's something that I would definitely recommend starting with either a pair of them or 4 of them if you can, because you'll just get more out of it. And then we have 2 different tunings, because those were the 2 areas on the measurements that still showed quite a bit of pressure, particularly on the back wall. So we took a measurement, and this is something I would very much so recommend doing. If somebody, if you're trying to put membrane traps in your room, definitely measure, see where things are at the listening position, but also take measurements with that microphone up against the boundary that these can go on. Because unlike porous absorbers, membrane traps are their performance is incredibly tied to their placement. So if you don't put them in the right spot in your room, they won't do anything. So the tuning of them needs to be matched to the room, and the placement of them needs to put them in a position where you have the highest pressure buildups, because they work off of the pressure buildups in your room, not air particle velocity or movement. So we have all 8 of them on the back wall, because in part, that was the area in this room that we actually had space to put them and had less space for them, with the gobos being more of the freestanding, movable back wall treatment. And that's also where we have the highest pressure buildup at those 2 frequencies. So we could get the most out of the membrane traps that way.
Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, that really also again segues to my next question, which is, or maybe can you just detail for us and walk us through the process of actually figuring out that exact placement? How did you actually do that in this particular case? What's the process behind that?
Yeah. So on the boundary itself, once you know, like, hey, this is the wall that we're going to put these on. Here are the frequencies that we have the highest buildups at that boundary. You don't necessarily need to be super concerned with where they go on the wall. In this case, we actually have measurements that we'll dive into in a second, with all of the 32 hertz ones stacked up right in the middle of the room, so like directly behind me, and then also spread out across the floor individually. And there's very, very little difference between the performance of those 2. So they're not like massively placement dependent once you have them on the right boundary. Where you don't want to put them is like those 64 hertz or 32 hertz traps. If I put them on the sidewalls, where they're not going to be activated by that pressure, because we don't have huge pressure buildups at those frequencies on the sidewalls, then they'd be a lot less effective. Or if we did so, even worse, if we did that like in the middle of the room where you have very, very little 32 hertz or that kind of thing, then we could create more problems just in terms of getting the most out of them. But I haven't really found in practice or in measurements and analyzing how they work that where on the boundary specifically makes a huge difference in their performance.
So does that mean you play a sine wave at the kind of offending frequency, and then you just check by ear, or do you use a microphone, or like how do you check where that ideal spot is along the boundary?
I would take measurements like using REW.
Okay.
You can see it, but it doesn't change that much, like along the boundary. So once you've identified like these are going to go on the back wall, it won't change massively like where the actual membrane traps need to go. It's much more so about putting them on the right boundary.
And that's probably because of the large wavelengths involved at these lower frequencies, right? And we get a buildup of energy across a much bigger area, right? I guess.
Yeah.
You can probably kind of, with a lot of work, kind of like tease out a tiny bit more here or there, but overall it's more a question of which general surface are you getting that pressure buildup at that particular frequency, and at that point also covering as much of that surface area with absorptive surface at that frequency, right? I mean, and that's exactly what I think why you said start with at least 2, probably 4. I think it's often underestimated how many of these you need, because you really want to cover as much of that surface area that has that pressure buildup as possible. Yeah, and the more surface area you give that energy to dissipate, the better it's going to be. The better it's going to work.
Yes, I guess the one, not exception, but kind of along the lines of like where they should be placed. We're talking at least these are tuned to axial modes, so like front to back. walls in this case. One area where you would want to be more careful about where you place those is if you start getting into tangential mode. So something that's going to involve 4 walls or 2 walls in the floor and the ceiling. And then, using a tool like AmRock to identify which corners are going to be the highest pressure buildups in those cases. You can do that again with measurements. But AmRock, like the room mode calculator, is a very useful tool because it will show you where your pressure buildups are going to be. So if you get into any of the room modes that are still problematic enough to where maybe a membrane trap is a useful tool, and it's generally only something that would really do below 100 hertz or so.
Yeah.
Getting higher up, rarely are they the best option. But so below that, making sure that if it is a tangential mode, that they are going to go in the right spots there in the room.
Sweet. Yeah, excellent. Let's jump into the measurements, shall we? I think we're all very curious to see just what happens. So maybe do you want to share your screen with us and just show us what happened, what you got?
Yeah. So we've got our spectrogram measurements pulled up here. And this is the room kind of as we left it in the last video. So video 3, none of the membrane traps were in here, but the room was kind of fully treated as is. And really what we were targeting at this stage was this lowest bit of energy that's left, this longer decay time that we're seeing. And then here on the left, we've got some different measurements that will go through that show different placements of the membrane traps, just the 32 hertz ones, and then the 32 hertz ones with the 64 hertz ones, and some different placements that I experimented with for all those as well. So
sounds amazing.
Let me jump through this a bit. So the first measurement I'm going to jump to from here is the 4 32 hertz membrane traps along the back wall. So all 4 of them were sitting on the floor, just kind of spread out across the length of that back wall. And right off the bat, in terms of like our low frequency energy and the decay that we were seeing there, that's really where we get that big change. And that's what we're looking for. It's just that extra tightness and punch in the low end so that the kick and the bass are super defined and really articulate with one another. And you can hear exactly what's going on. If you're mixing, that's the thing that allows you to really hear if your compression's working, or if they're playing nicely together in terms of balance, because now the room's just kind of getting out of the way. And then
really, really cool.
The next measurement was this same 4 32 hertz membrane traps, but now they're all centered on the back wall. So they're stacked too high and directly in the middle of the room. And not a lot of change here. So this kind of goes back to what we were just talking about in terms of like, does placement, once you've identified which boundary to put them on, matter that much? And it for the most part, it doesn't. As long as they're on the correct boundary, so an area within the room or the boundary within the room that has the most pressure, they're going to work pretty well, because these are huge waveforms that we're talking about, particularly all the way down here. We're looking at mostly, some of these changes are actually well below this 32 hertz where we've got them tuned. So we kind of jump through here. A lot of this change is actually occurring all the way down to 21 hertz. So just kind of getting rid of some of that room rumble that would otherwise be occurring.
And I think this is just shows us one of the advantages also shows us one of the advantages of working with a membrane resonance trap, because they're typically more broadband than, for example, a Helmholtz resonator, which is really, really narrow band. If you design a Helmholtz resonator perfectly, it works extremely well, but it's hard to do that because you really have to hit that exact frequency. And with these, you can be a bit more, it's still more science than that, but it is a more broadband absorption character, and that way you can get, even with a trap tuned to 32 hertz, you can get, as we are seeing here, a great effect much lower than that.
Exactly, yeah. So then this next measurement here has the addition of the 4 64 hertz traps. And this went back to all 4 of them being laid out on the floor. So we've got the 32 hertz ones in their original position, each on the floor, and then the 64 hertz ones on top of those, just sitting on them. And just kind of some shuffling around now, not like a big, this big drop that we saw in 20 hertz, 25 hertz, and up to 32 hertz isn't really going down anymore, nor would we expect it to. But we've got some just kind of shuffling around in what we see higher up.
And I think what we'll see also is, because the 64 hertz isn't a peak, it's a dip, if I see that correctly.
Yes.
Right. And so that will probably be more obvious once we look at the frequency response, because what we're looking at is not something coming down, but something coming up.
Exactly. And this is interesting because don't have it in here, unfortunately, but because I'm terrible at saving things, but this measurement, and when we had the microphone on the back wall, actually measuring where the pressure was at the listening position, which is where all these measurements were taken from. There is a dip at 64 hertz, and we're actually gaining some of this energy back. But
right.
At the back wall, there's a bunch of pressure there. And so by absorbing some of that energy at the back wall, if I jump over to the frequency response here, you actually see when we add those 64 hertz membrane traps, we're getting more of that back at the listening position.
And that's one of the funny things that might be a bit confusing about damping room modes, right? Because the room mode or room modes can cause both peaks and dips at the listening position, but that just means that we get that there is a resonance present at that frequency. It can cause both peaks and dips. If you then damp that frequency, it will either reduce the peak or bring up the dip, depending on which of those is apparent at the listening position, even though in the spot where you're actually treating that room mode, in both cases, there will be a pressure buildup, right? So this is one of those things that is confusing. Yeah, that can be confusing. You want to try and put that trap in a spot of high pressure, and that will reduce the effect of that room mode, and then we'll have consequently a bringing up or bringing down effect at the actual listening position.
Yeah, exactly. It's also the thing that can be a little confusing, just in terms of like understanding. So if you put a bass trap in your room, that often translates to you hearing more low end at the listening position. And that is either something that, like in this case, we'll see on the actual measurements, or it can oftentimes be just a matter of balancing out the frequency response. So as things become more balanced across the frequency spectrum, the perception that you have at the listening position is actually that, like, oh, all of a sudden you might get more low end, or you get more of the 60 to 90 hertz range because we're treating it and that huge dip's going away. So bass trapping doesn't mean all of their bass energies leaving the room or disappearing. And it's also it's also the reason that you cannot over treat your low end in the room, or you can't put too many bass traps in the room, because all that happens is you treat the low end. And as we can see that, this room sounds great and is actually quite balanced and flat in terms of measurements go, but there's still a lot that, like, if you had all of the room in the world or all the space in the world to put treatment in here, that this room could be improved. And so it is always a matter of, like, you put bass traps in, you get more balance, and you ultimately generally hear more of it. Not less, it's just more balance. So it's always kind of maybe not the best name.
Bass traps, terrible name.
A little bit of a conundrum there, but yeah.
Yeah, cool. Well, let's continue on. What else did you try?
All of these measurements so far had the membrane, that mass loaded vinyl, facing towards the front of the room. So if I turn around and those gobos were there, I would see the membrane. After that, I turned those membranes around and wanted to see if we'd get more performance out of it. Kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, we want the membranes placed in a part of the room where you have the most pressure. And with that in mind, if we turn the boxes around, technically you're putting the membrane in a higher pressure zone, particularly with those 32 hertz boxes, because they're about 12 inches deep or so. So if we jump over to this, what we'll see is a little bit more improvement in the actual spectrogram measurements here. So a slight shortening up of some of these decay times.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, at our specific tuning frequency, actually a pretty significant change. But there are some other things that change if we look at the frequency response. And that's more correlating to the fact that we now have these big boxes that are acting as a big reflective surface. And even though those gobos are there, we're changing just kind of the overall space within the room and how it's responding. And that's more visible if we jump back to the frequency response graph here. So a couple of interesting things. One, just the 100 hertz, this actually gets a little bit smoother, and nothing below that changes. So purely time changes that we're seeing from 100 hertz and down, or I guess really 90 hertz and down, because we have a bit of smoothing here at 100 hertz, which is great. But then some more interesting things that we see, just kind of this little dip is getting worse. A little bit of movement here from this like 150 to 250 hertz range. And then this was kind of the most odd thing to me, was this change at 660 hertz. None of that's super alarming. I think you could probably set the room up either way and probably tweak the gobo placement to combat some of these other things here that are happening, because it's all at this stage pretty much back wall dependent. We have also made membrane traps with absorption on the front of them, or in this case, what would be the back of them, so we can kind of maximize where they go. So it just depends on, the room. Technically, putting that membrane closer to the boundary is going to allow it to work a little bit better, as we can see when we're looking at the spectrogram. But depending on whether or not there's actual absorption or panels going in front of your membrane traps, or if they're going to be facing out into the room, that can impact which side of that trap you really want facing your room.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then I got a little bit more curious and experimented a bit more here for our next measurement. I actually took out the big 6x4 foot front wall bass trap panel that we have in here and put half of our membrane traps, so two 32 hertz and two 64 hertz ones, on the front wall, and then kept two on the back. And this did not work very well. So they're definitely staying on the back wall. This is more related to reflection issues off of the front wall. But what also clearly didn't work very well was just the overall time decay performance that we're getting here. And, that's quite clear just in terms of the spectrogram and what it's showing us, but also very much so if we jump back to our overlays and our frequency response. As soon as that big bass trap panel comes out, we immediately get some of the earlier problems that we had in the initial treatment stages, where we've got this very, very big dip here at 132 hertz or so, and then a peak corresponding right above that. That's, worsened. So didn't see an improvement on the time domain by splitting up our membrane traps across the room. And also we're very much so sacrificing some of our balance across the frequency response. So definitely did not leave the membrane traps there for long. They immediately went back to the back wall where they were working.
This just shows what we said at the beginning, right? This is the reason why you want to start with porous absorption. You want to start broadband, you want to start with porous absorption, because in a small room, you just don't have the luxury of doing both. And in that case, porous absorption is just the better bang for your buck, because it works broadband, because it's more flexible, because it's easier to use.
100%. It's that is how ultimately we can get the best result possible for probably 99% of the rooms that we work on. Any room like this where it's a good sized room, but if you really, really want super tight, solid, accurate, and balanced low end, this room has already become much, much, much smaller. Sounds great, but functionally it might be too small for most people if you're trying to use it as a control room and you have musicians in there coming in and out of the tracking rooms, or if you just want more space and you had instruments in here. It's always a balancing act in terms of what is the functionality of the room and how much space do you have. And so, if you put membrane traps everywhere and you were trying to have your instruments in here and you had multiple people and it wasn't just me and Barley, it would get very tight very quickly.
It would, yeah. Well, maybe this is a good point to just stay with the frequency response. Maybe can you just show us, we've looked at a few of them already, but maybe can you just show us the before and after again, kind of the before with the ideal after, and then also just the scatter faces, because obviously those you brought those in for the absorbers that we can see the gobos behind you. And we haven't really talked about that yet, but maybe just walk us through the before and after for the resonance traps, and then what happens when you put the scatter faces on.
Yeah, definitely. So this is I've got the after highlighted here, but this is the before and after. from 20 hertz all the way up to 2000 hertz. So we've got, as we talked about earlier, a little bit of we actually kind of, as you would expect, this is the one case where we're absorbing some of that energy. And this is below where the ATCs that are in here drop. They're like -3 at 40 hertz. They go below that clearly, but at a higher drop off rates. So we can see we are killing a little bit of that, or absorbing and dampening some of that 32, 34 hertz range here. Otherwise, though, really just kind of an overall smoothing of our low end range, particularly in that 60, 64 hertz range where we're gaining some of that back. And then similarly, this dip is also improved a little bit. So just some subtle but pretty helpful smoothing across the low end of the frequency spectrum, and primary, as we were looking at the spectrogram, huge gains in the time domain. If we use the backward facing ones, pretty similar results, some slightly different shapes that we see here in terms of this dip got worse instead of getting better. But we gained back more of this null here at 63, 60 hertz. So pretty similar regardless of which way we had the membrane traps oriented. And then let me add in the scatter face measurement here. And this is pretty similar, other than we start to see, let me jump this up to 20,000 hertz so we can see a little bit more reflected energy. So things are, as you would kind of expect to see, jumping around a little bit more here. It was funny, I put the scatter faces on this morning, actually, so not too long ago, but was listening. May not leave them on the gobos. The room is very, very dry sounding, but with the scatter faces that we already had in here, was working quite well. And they're very pleasing sounding, but you do lose a little bit of the articulation and tightness that you'd have in, like, particularly from like probably 2K and upwards, to where it's smoother sounding, but not quite as necessarily like pinpoint accurate when it comes to where is the hi-hat in this place. So there's almost like a little bit of a smearing and smoothing that occurs, which is kind of what you would expect as you introduce scattering or diffusion. And this is where taste comes into it a lot too, of like, now I'm at a point where I was used to the way that this room sounded and I liked that level of detail. And I didn't find the room fatiguing. And one of the main purposes of these scatter faces is to retain enough reflection so that we can spend, multiple hours in this space listening to music without getting tired. If it was purely a listening room, I'd absolutely leave them there. It's also something I may just experiment, like if I get rid of just the middle ones, pull those off and see how it goes, because it's a very pleasing sound, but doesn't feel quite as just like the pinpoint accuracy and detail that was there before. And that part I kind of liked.
Yeah, interesting. How talking about the actual listening experience in the low end, what changed perceptually when you added in those membrane traps?
Yeah, that was fun. So that was one of the bigger changes since the initial treatment went in. We've seen a lot of big variations in the last video in terms of what was changing across the frequency spectrum and introducing nulls and fixing nulls and creating new ones and all that. This didn't change much here, but if I jump back to this, just in terms of like sitting here at the listening position and the change from not having the membrane traps in here, so having this extra decay in the lowest octave bands within the room, and then changing over to this was pretty massive feeling and sounding. So the clarity in the low end and the tightness that was there, and really being able to identify what's going on in the kick and the bass, particularly in synths that have a lot of low frequency energy in there, was pretty fantastic. That change felt much more substantial than it shows, and it's just everything kind of just went from feeling like it was like out here to just sort of in the low end coming in and being incredibly focused and tight and detailed. And it really gets out of the way of the rest of the music, so you're not having any masking then of those longer decay times, and that covering up anything else higher up in the frequency spectrum. And so it's just this overall really, really awesome change in terms of how things feel, the just the overall clarity, and it's great.
Interesting. Yeah, amazing. Yeah, and this is one of those aspects where it becomes apparent that everything in music is relative, right? You control the low end more, and then anything that happens down there has less of an effect on the mids and the highs, and so those actually become more detailed as well, right? So there's definitely some kind of magic that happens there in terms of the perception of the music.
Yeah, definitely. And it's kind of, that's, again, I think we've talked about it this whole series now, but it's like, it's all about balance. So if we can balance out the decay time here, even though it's all the way down at the very bottom of the frequency spectrum, and get this area more in line with everything happening above it, everything sounds better. And so improving that one area really affects the whole frequency spectrum, or everything that we hear and perceive.
Right. So just out of curiosity, and we haven't actually looked at this either before we started recording, but what does the RT60 look like in comparison before and after?
Exactly the same. So this was kind of surprising to me, and just from the standpoint of looking at the spectrograms and seeing how clear the changes are there. Actually, I lied. It gets worse when you have them facing backwards, and it gets better if they're forward facing, but the spectrogram shows the opposite.
It's one of the reasons why I don't pay too much attention to RT60. It's such an inaccurate measurement in these small rooms, especially when there's so much treatment in there already. All you can really tell are trends, and then at this point, maybe not even that. Yeah, and it's so easy. There's so many exterior factors that can mess up this measurement and make it invalid. And maybe even just the fact that we are measuring in such a small room by itself is already kind of making it invalid. So
the concept of reverb time does not apply to small rooms because you don't have a diffuse sound field. You have direct sound, you have reflected sound, and there's a decay time to it, but the actual concept and principle of RT60 doesn't apply. I think it's always interesting to look at. It's, if I jump to the scatter faces, interestingly, not in terms of the low end at all, but actually do smooth out in some interesting ways, just kind of the high end. But yeah, it's RT60 in terms of, or T20 in this case, in terms of understanding what's going on in your room. Rarely does it provide a lot of insight other than like the room's treated, the room's not treated, because you'll see all the high frequency changes. You'll see some of those low frequency changes. But if you want to really understand what's going on in your room and being able to hone in on specific frequencies, I find that the spectrogram and the waterfall plot so much more useful. I just lean more on the spectrogram because it can provide more clarity. You can really zoom in and see exactly what's changing, even at these really high level zoomed in changes from like, okay, do I want my membrane traps facing one direction or do I want them facing the other direction?
Can you actually show us the waterfall just before and after as well? I'm curious.
This is without the membrane traps.
Yeah.
This is with the membrane traps facing forward.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is with them facing backward.
Right. Yeah. Can you just go do a forward and no trap comparison?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. There we can definitely see that effect happening. And I mean, one of the issues you had, I don't know if you paid particular attention to it this time when you took the measurements, but that there is the studio is in quite a noisy surrounding.
Yes.
So, but it looks pretty clean to me right now. So
yeah, I stayed late last night and nobody was here working, and tried to take it when there's a train that runs right behind our shop, and I was like sitting at my desk. You can feel the whole floor shaking. So waited for that to go by as long as possible. And so these ones should be pretty clean. But yeah, there's always some noise outside. But that's, for most of us, that's pretty typical.
Yeah, I mean, I think this looks really great. It pretty much shows us what we want to see, or what we can show at this point. Is there anything else that you want to show us relating to this, or any particular notes, any remarks that you had that you still want to share with us regarding these membrane traps?
I don't think so. I think that pretty much covers it.
I'm sure a bunch of questions will pop up. So for everybody watching, so basically what we're going to do, since this was a bit of a shorter video, and we are actually recording this when the second video just actually got released. So I'm sure there'll be a bunch of questions on the third video and this one as well when it comes out. So we'll do another fifth video in this series, just doing a Q&A session, question and answer session, to hit up all your remarks and all your questions and go through those. But with that, I think this is a good spot to leave it. Graham?
Yeah.
Any final words?
No. I don't know. Thank you. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Exactly.
It's been a fun journey.
It has been a fun journey.
Excited to see the questions.
Exactly, as am I. So yeah, again, for everybody watching, that final video will once again be on my channel, because obviously this one is on Graham's channel. And so be on the lookout for that. It's going to be a few weeks. We're going to let these, we're going to release these first, and then see what questions pop up, and then we'll answer those in the final video. I hope this was interesting to you out there watching. I definitely think it's interesting. We don't get to see the effects, or just how to use membrane traps in practice very often. So it's very, very interesting to see just how that works. So yeah, I hope you got something out of that. Thanks everybody for watching. Graham, thanks again for putting all this effort in, and see you soon.
All right, see you.
Bye.